Welcome to today's presentation, Understanding Ergonomics, a guide for the safety professionals. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Kevin Orvis. I'm a doctor of podiatric medicine and founder and president of Mega Comfort, a work-life wellness solutions company and leading provider of anti-fatigue insoles for the workplace. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Patrick Carley, professor and doctorate of physical therapy. Dr. Carley is a consultant for Mega Comfort and is the co-founder of the Ergonomics Collaboration Group and professor in the Doctor of Physical Therapy program at American International College in Springfield, Massachusetts. He teaches human biomechanics, gross anatomy, and ergonomics, and has been assisting companies with various ergonomic projects for their workforce since 1991. Today's presentation is an accessory to the handbook entitled Understanding Ergonomics, a guide for safety professionals. This handbook came about from the overwhelming need to support those individuals on the front lines of safety. The handbook is meant to be a tool, easily accessible and rich, with new ways of thinking about how we can engage work for many industries and economic sectors of our country. A brief summary of the main aspects of the handbook will be provided today in this presentation, followed by their application in two real-life manufacturing scenarios. I'd now like to turn things over to Professor Carley.
Hello, I'm Professor Carley, and I'm here to kind of bring over some more of the components of the process of ergonomics. But one of the processes I'd like to explore with you is like the concept of work zones. And the work zones are predicated on basically our anatomy. So the work zones are set up in first zone, second zone, or third zone. Or we can call them primary zones, secondary zones, and tertiary zones. But the primary work zone are activities that we do a lot of. We only keep tools and objects and things needed in that process of completing the task. And that primary zone is if you were to put your elbows by your side and wave your hands in and out. That area underneath your forearm and your hand would represent the primary zone. So those are vital to keeping those tools that are only used in that task, keeping other objects out of the way. The secondary zone is essentially if you were to just lift up your hand and put your fingertips out. So that area, if you wave your hands back and forth, that area underneath your arm, forearm, and hand represents the secondary zones. In that zone should be tools that you need to complete those tasks. And so something like a keyboard and a mouse, those are things that you would keep in that area. Also a computer monitor or a phone. So these are things that we use throughout the day, but less frequently than the primary zone. Tertiary zones are things that we should keep out of our distance. So in other words, you can see it's beyond the fingertips. So that doesn't encumber the person's ability to complete their task. When we have objects that are impeding in the primary and secondary zone, we actually find that people assume awkward work postures or really slows down their process. So it impedes not only productivity, but it also sets up the person for musculoskeletal injury. Another thing that we always kind of keep an eye on with ergonomics is the eye. The eye has two components that we pay close attention to, and that is our focal length. Where is it that we have to see, and what is our own focal length? So the head will actually move back and forth to accommodate that focal length. So sometimes we have to move work in closer to the worker, or sometimes a little bit further out to accommodate for their focal length. It's usually within maybe 3-4 inches, but it can really help out with reducing eye fatigue. The other one is eye dominance. So whenever we start to realize that we have a dominant eye, then we want to keep most of the fine or detailed tasks more to that dominant eye side. That way we're not turning our head excessively, and then that way we reduce any particular injuries to the neck and the cervical area. When we start to think about ergonomics, we think about it, as we said, like a process, but it also looks at the body on how it has evolved. And one of the unique things that we note about the body is that the head is positioned and balanced over the chest and the rest of the spine. The spine and the chest is actually positioned well and balanced over the hips. So when we look at that, we have to keep that in mind. So if we can use the body as a way it was evolved, then we can actually be more efficient about the body's interaction with work. So keeping that concept in mind, and that is that keeping the head as balanced over our body and keeping our body balanced over our hips is a great way to think about posture. Now we're thinking about it in terms of balance. And it's another way that we can keep in mind as we start to think about ergonomics. One of the interesting things is that the head weighs about 9% of body weight. And if we think about, let's say on average, it weighs about 10 pounds. So in this case, when we start to lean the head forward, the actual weight of the head, even though it doesn't increase, the amount of force or distance away from that out of posture position or out of balance position actually creates a lot more force from the muscles to deal with the weight of the head being forward. So that changes, it's almost like that analogy of if you were to kind of put away a jug of milk or a jug of water, the further we hold it out, the weight of that jug hasn't changed, but the distance has, and the muscles have to work harder. So that's why balance is really important. If we can actually do that, then we can actually, again, keep a tab on the potential for eye strain and neck strain. Here's an interesting scenario that we were talking about, that when we apply those concepts to work something like what we're seeing above here. And the pictures really kind of point out that keeping things in balance is what we really have to keep focused on. So the gentleman on the left, you can see the head is balanced over the body. You can see that the spine is actually balanced well over the hips. And that's a really good position for our muscles and our spine and our structure actually to work well with. When we say the object and the interaction with the worker on the right, we can see that he's bent over at the hips excessively. The head is trying to extend. So there's a lot of effort that's going on. You can see he's got to be reaching now. He's got to support his body weight with his other hand. So it's now restricting his ability to work with both hands, not just, now he's just forced to use the one hand just for balance. So the stability and all the things we talked about with using our body the way it has evolved, you can see we're doing this machine, the task that he had to work on this machine took a long time. And it also took a long time for him to recover from these sustained positions. As a result, there was a lot of strain on the worker's back, legs, shoulders, and particularly the neck. The problem was for this company is that this process, this particular machine area was a bottleneck for their production. So in this case, the worker was actually so fatigued that he could only do 2 machines an hour. So when we start to look at this whole area about what we can do to address maybe from an ergonomics process, we can actually see that the machine was actually laid out quite nicely for us to come up with an ergonomic solution. It's interesting that when you look at a lot of machines, the engineers that design the machines do it with the purpose of completing the task and with no regard to the individual that has to interact with that machine. So ergonomics is really the person who has the process to actually try to mitigate some of those issues that pop up. In this case, when we started to engage the process, keeping in mind balance, posture, those things about our body that has evolved to our current situation, we realized that the machine lends itself well to having a bench actually set up so that we can actually have the person rest their trunk on that bench. So if we can do that, we can actually provide a lot more support for that individual. So this was a prototype, and we could see where the height and the angle of this was really important to kind of play around with it. You can see that this prototype allowed us to do this. Again, going back to ergonomics as a process. We knew that we had a general idea of what we wanted to do and then fine tune it along the way. What we wanted to do is to make sure that when we did, objectively assess this effort, we wanted to make sure that we looked at muscles that were going to be most affected. And the muscles underneath the latissimus dorsi were the muscles that we actually recorded. And those muscles underneath the latissimus dorsi, we can capture with surface electromyography or EMG. In this case, the muscles that we're looking at is what's known as the iliocostalis. In other words, it comes from the ilium, the pelvis, and the muscles extend out to the different ribs. So holding up the trunk from that perspective. So we measured activity on the right side and activity on the left side. So as you can see, when we started to work out the process, this picture on the left indicates the person really reaching, trying to do the best they can. They're bracing themselves with their knees and feet so they don't fall into the machine. You can see the curvature of the spine here. So the muscles are trying like desperate to hold the weight of the trunk and the head up. And you can see the head is really working hard to hold up the weight of the head. On top of that, the person is forced to reach way out further. So you can see the extension, the protraction of the scapulus. With the ergonomic intervention here, just thinking about this, again, we adjusted the angle so that it would actually allow him to rest on this. And when he did, you can see the muscle of the back much more relaxed, the head in a great position, again, now balanced over his body. And we'll look at his shoulders. Now, the weight of the arms are nice and relaxed, so he can freely work with two hands rather than being forced to intermittently work with one hand only. So a simple idea like a platform lends itself well to the design of the machine. So this is the work activity of this individual without the benefit of that ergonomic intervention. So I'm gonna actually provide you a little bit of video. What you're looking at is EMG. The red is the right side and the left is the blue side. So you can see the amount of curvature, you can see the amount of muscle activity that's going on. The top parts are the raw EMG and the bottom part is the integrated EMG. But you can see the high peaks of the muscle activity going on. So we're doing this wirelessly. So if I show you now the same EMG, same parameters, same everything, and the only thing we did was actually slide the prototype of the bench in there. So let me show you what that looks like. You can see his back is now straight. When we look down at the EMG is much lower, way lower, as a matter of fact. And then you can see when he stands up, we see the muscle activity pick up. And the amazing thing is that when he's standing, when he's standing now, the same muscle activity is occurring when he's laying on that bench. Whereas before, it was really, the amplitude was really high on those muscles, telling us that that would explain why he was so tired. So when we start to look at it, we look at a collaboration. When we start to look at ergonomics, it's always involving input from other people. So sometimes, typically, ergonomics will work on a problem and involve other members like employees, management, maybe outside consultants to give a fresh view, or maybe more of an academic view. And they create a team. And the goal is, again, to try to retain a lot of the balance that is needed to reduce the amount of strains and sprains that go on that force a lot of frustrations in the workplace. In this case, we were able to objectively record the data so that we understood that not only were we getting subjective information from the workers saying this is so much better or so much easier, I'm not as tired, but then we also get confirmation from an objective measuring tool like the EMG. So in this case, what happened was he was able to finish 2 machines and not feel tired in a half an hour. And what had happened before they changed the rules, he would stand around for another half an hour just watching the clock. So after a while, the workers were asking if they can do 2 more machines. So what happened is increased the productivity by 100%. And the workers were not getting tired. The process then removed a lot of the bottleneck and the productivity went up. There's a lot of times what we see with ergonomics, we see where we're actually trying to reduce the potential for risk, for injury, but in the process, we actually improve productivity. So a lot of times, because these are pre-established machines and the process has been going on for a long time, but the risk and the injury still persist, we, as ergonomic kind of thinking people, we actually have to think about challenging the status quo. Here, a very classic kind of challenge to the status quo was that if you looked at standing at the workplace, a lot of people would just put anti-fatigue mats down. Nobody ever measured objectively if it really is anti-fatigue. So it's interesting when we start to look at the complaints that we were getting, and that the mat was not in the particular area that they wanted. The budget really couldn't afford a lot of mats all over the place. They were making it extremely difficult for them to maintain the cleaning of the area. So what happened was there was, again, a challenge to the status quo, and we wanted to think of something else. What would be another solution that would actually help with a big sector of the economy, like hospitality, when you go to a hotel and everybody's standing behind the desk. Utilities are out there walking or climbing or standing in those buckets. Transportation, and of course, manufacturing. Everybody's standing in manufacturing. So if we can think of a better way to do this, then it would make sense. When we start to look at this particular area, we can see where the issue of seeing how workers work in the workplace is pretty interesting, because they're doing a lot of work and they're using a lot of muscles. But what we don't understand is that as they are forcing a lot of activity, engaging stuff like this, we can see where all of a sudden the worker is actually pushing against the ground and the ground is pushing up against them. And in essence, when you look at it closely, you can see where the interaction is not between the bottom of the footwear and the ground, but actually the interaction is what you can see. And that is between the foot, right here, and the inside of the footwear. Because we can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So when you look at the interaction, I want to show you this clip of how important muscles play in actually mitigating that opposite and equal pushback from the ground. So if you can watch that foot, you can see that without muscles in there, the body gets a tremendous amount of pushback from the ground. So when we start to think about it this way, putting something underneath the foot makes a lot more sense from an ergonomic standpoint. So we just have to figure out what kind of materials. So there's a lot of work went into trying to figure out what materials would actually work well to mitigate a lot of that shock absorption and the ground pushing back up. So Mega Comfort actually figured out that formulation and that design, and in that process, we were able to kind of, again, try to measure what was going on with that interaction between the body and this new way of thinking about putting insoles in between the person and the inside of the shoe, where really the interaction is, the ground. So this happened at Hasbro Games when we tried to look at maybe pulling up the floor mats and then just issuing insoles to everyone. When we did this in a number of different ways, we got a lot of positive subjective reactions. And their perception of decreased discomfort, that they just felt better, they could, the standing throughout the day was not as difficult as it was before. And after a while, they didn't even miss the mats. They weren't even talking about the mats anymore. So, but Hasbro wanted to get some objective measurements on this. So we were called in again to put electrodes on the legs. And what we did was we measured the muscle in the front of the leg and the back of the leg. And this is before we actually had the wireless. We actually had to carry around the EMG box that was communicating with the computer. And in this, we were able to secure the electrodes. You can see with the ACE wrapping. You can see the students here kind of walking with the individual at the workplace. So we would measure activity with and without. And we also measured it on the floor mats, off the floor mats, and then with the insole inside the shoe. And what we found was quite stunning. And that is that on the top part, we can actually see the muscle activity, again, the raw EMG for the muscle in the front of the leg and the muscle in the back of the leg. And you can see the amplitude of those signals, which means the muscle is working pretty hard. With the insole in there, we're walking the same distance, same surface. We can see the EMG data is showing visually decreased, but also when we did the integrated data underneath here, we actually measured a lot less muscle activity. The graph on the right actually shows where we measured complaints of, or actually the perceptions of discomfort in the back and the top one. You can see the yellow one is actually the overall responses. And then we saw the most common complaints of discomfort were at the feet. So this would be just before we actually issued the insoles. This is after 3 weeks of actually wearing the insoles. We asked them to report their perceptions of pain at the back and hips and also at the feet. And then we did this again about 6 weeks. And you can see where the subjective perceptions were actually lining up with the EMG, the objective findings. So when we look at that, we suddenly realize that putting something underneath the foot and then being a mitigation between the inside of the footwear, which is essentially the ground, seemed like it was a logical intervention. And when we lined up the subjective data and the objective measures, then that really convinced that we were on the right track. So again, challenging the status quo is really a challenge quite a bit. But once we start to look at it from a data collection type of the process of ergonomics, we can see where we're getting very, very close to really coming up with the right solution. In this case, it was a process that actually convinced us that we had achieved what we were looking for in this case, and that is that we understand that putting something in between the worker and the inside of the shoe was the way to go. And actually it tends to work out even on a budget level also. So remember, keep in mind that ergonomics is a process. And if you don't get it right the first time, essentially you're going to be getting closer and closer all the time, like we found. So in this case, you can see the benefits of looking at improving postures. If we can avoid poor postures, we can look at ergonomics as being a twofold entity. In other words, it reduces the injury and while improving productivity. And Kevin, do you want to kind of pick up on maybe some last thoughts on this?
So sure. So in the first example that Professor Carley went through, obviously observing and recognizing poor postures led to an ergonomic intervention that reduced the risk of injury while improving productivity. In the second example, information is knowledge. So by placing the cushioning as close to the foot surface, improve the employee responses while lowering muscle activity and costs associated with floor mats, thereby showing that the insoles truly were anti-fatigue in nature. So the handbook provides you with an understanding behind ergonomics and ways to increase your observation skills for further risk reduction, productivity, and cost-effective interventions in the future. So in conclusion, I just wanted to thank everybody for their time today and your interest in ergonomics. So today's presentation, along with the ergonomic handbook, will be terrific resources for you in your pursuit of creating a safer and healthier workplace for your customers. So if you have any questions or require additional information, please feel free to email myself at drkevin@megacomfort.com, drkevan@megacomfort.com, or directly to Professor Carley at patrick.carley@aic.edu. Thanks again for your time. Thank you.